Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Open World Chat. I am your beloved founder and host, John Odom, and I'm here with co-host Mark Card.
Howdy.
And I'm so thrilled about this episode. We've got a guest, Leigh McKagen, who has participated in all kinds of scholarly Star Trek endeavors. And our topic today is going to be the kind of complex, sometimes troubled, sometimes inspiring, sometimes cringe-worthy history of Star Trek and women. And it's something I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. Leigh has contributed scholarly articles to the Routledge Handbook of Star Trek. You told me your dissertation was a specific case study on Voyager. I'm wondering
Correct.
if you can't introduce yourself and tell us what that dissertation was about.
I'd be happy to, John. Mark, thank you so much for having me. I always love the opportunity to talk about Star Trek in any capacity, and I'm thrilled to be here today. My academic and scholarly work on Star Trek is more focused specifically on threads of imperialism that are retained in the narrative. My expertise, my academic background is on political and cultural theories, particularly post-colonial studies, feminist studies, and I'm interested in the political theory and history of empire, and how that shows up in science fiction, particularly American science fiction, and that has become most specific to a study of Star Trek. Which happened kind of by accident. And I continue to blame my husband for this because when I was in the early stages of my dissertation work, my PhD work, he was just like, let's sit down and, do something in the evening, watch some TV. Oh, hey, The Next Generation is on Netflix. Let's start.
Yeah,
And
he had to distract you from your dissertation is what he had to
exactly, right?
do.
And it ended up not working because then I was over here taking notes on the couch while we're watching these shows. And then went through Voyager and almost all of Deep Space Nine, I'll be honest and say I lost steam toward the end. Not because it wasn't good, but because life got even busier with another baby and COVID and all the things that happen around that time. But yeah, so my dissertation specifically looks at the way that American imperialism in particular, Western exceptionalism and individualism and things like manifest destiny are factored into the frontier narrative, the castaway narrative of Voyager. I did a particular study on Janeway and also B'Elanna Torres and Seven of Nine in one chapter that looked at the way those characters function, to sort of work as to kind of create a family on the ship, right? In contrast to everything else in the Delta Quadrant as they're on their way home. And so many of my other publications have sort of spawned from that, including a few that look actually at Battlestar Galactica as another relevant and particularly important American science fiction show. But I really like working with Star Trek because not only do a lot of people know about it, even if they've never seen it, even if, or more casually, they at least sort of know what I'm talking about a little bit. It makes a little bit of sense. And, there's just so much material to work with. I'm also particularly thrilled by all of the new Star Trek. I haven't seen the most recent season of Discovery, but I do really love what's happening in basically all of the new iterations of Star Trek. I'm in love with Prodigy. And actually starting to work
Yay.
on a project this summer specific to that one. So I'm really waiting for the second season to come out, both so that I can watch it and maybe get my daughter into it a little bit more than I was able to in the first season. I was a little bummed about that. She wasn't too into it, but I was.
Well,
And
yay.
see where
Yay
the
for
second
having a
season takes
prodigy fan.
us. So yeah. So I don't know if that fully answered your question. Kind of got away from me there, but yeah, so I'm also very interested, of course, in Star Trek as a female fan and a female academic. It has tended to be a more, at least male fan dominated arena. Not that the female fans weren't there, but that the male fans were a little bit more visible. But as I did more learning about the history of Star Trek and its fans and stuff throughout my dissertation, there are some really interesting and incredible contributions made even early on by female fans and letter writing campaigns and other things. And of course, just being there. And that's really the reason, I think, in large part, that Voyager, right, gets Janeway up in that captain's chair in the first place. Because there's something very interesting happening in the mid 90s there. And to put a female captain on that, and, it definitely got a lot of backlash from some male fans in particular, as we've seen more recently with Discovery as well. But yeah, so there's a lot of really interesting things happening there. I really, really love, although I'm often very critical of it as a scholar, I really love the whole universe as a fan. And it's really fun to work with.
It's interesting. Voyager is going to have a lot to unpack. We spent a little time on there when you get to what was going on in front of the scenes and behind the scenes. But first of all, let me just say I'm surrounded by academics. Mark's a PhD too. I did not graduate college. I'm the poor, uneducated slob here. So, anyways, but Mark, I want to bring you in because you're a big original series fan.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, when you think of diversity in Star Trek, well, let's just start with the very first episode, right? Let's start with the cage. What did you think of the cage, just as a general piece of science fiction? And I want to get Leigh's take on what might be a little under the surface there.
I like it. I think it's an interesting episode. Of course, the most obvious thing you're hinting at is the fact that you've got a female first officer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, but it's like everything else in Star Trek. It's like our discussion about the Prime Directive. The intent is there, but the execution isn't exactly perfect. You've got Mina, that was her name, right?
Yes.
Sounds right, yeah.
Mina
Yeah.
there, who's captive and who is in reality horribly malformed or disfigured from the crash of the original ship that came to Talos in the first place. And her only value really is as a broodmare for the Talosians. And so you run into this dichotomy of progressive and regressive at the same time. So you've got this aesthetic where only the beautiful is good and only the beautiful is useful. But then on the other hand, they want to say something about including females in the episode. So it's problematic, but it's also kind of progressive. So it's just kind of interesting that you've got this dichotomy. And, we can't exactly ignore the pulchritude of Majel Barrett in that particular role. I mean, look at who they picked up for to play number one in the new series, a former Victoria's Secret model, Rebecca Romaine.
Huh, that's true. So what do you think of number one, Leigh?
Well, I think that a lot of what Mark is really sort of zeroing in on one of the things that I always come back to with Star Trek, which is, the heart's in the right place. I love Roddenberry's original vision, although, it is not without its flaws, right? And I do think it is very important to put the context of a show in the late 1960s into the context of the late 1960s on American television. And I think the fact that they added women at all is going a long way to sort of the vision that Roddenberry sort of ultimately did want, right? And they mentioned that in a lot of the literature about Voyager, for example, and putting Janeway up there, and a lot of the producers in those mid 1990s years go back to Roddenberry, right, and say, this is what Roddenberry wanted. Hey guys, it's cool. This is what Roddenberry wanted, So they're using that as kind of like a way to acknowledge, hey, this is okay. He would have been okay with this, and so I think that, while it isn't without its problems, and the same can certainly be said of Uhura, right, and casting an African-American woman on screen was huge and very important, right? And there's a great anecdote and story that Nichelle Nichols actually told in interviews, years later, which was that she was thinking of pulling out of the show because she didn't like her role, because it was a bit role, right? She served no purpose on the ship, functionally speaking. And she was actually having a chat with Martin Luther King about it at a meeting, a convention, a benefit dinner or something like that. And, she mentioned that she didn't really want to be doing it anymore. And he said to her, no, this is important, right? Because you're not the maid. I'm paraphrasing, of course. But, and that really struck home for her. And of course, people like Whoopi Goldberg credit her presence on that show in the 60s as fundamental to getting them right to further break boundaries and to get to the point where we can put Michael Burnham right up on the bridge in a command position by the end of Discovery. Which isn't to say there's not problems with that either, right? But the fact that they exist is to some, is certainly very important. And I always try and remember that when I'm meting my criticism of things like that, as, but more could have been done, right? And can be done in the future. And I think that's where Star Trek has so much potential. If we keep pushing, and if it keeps pushing the boundaries, right, to say, oh, now we can have a happily married gay couple on the Discovery, and that's okay. We're coming a long way.
I wanted to pop in here and say that when you look at the role of number one, it's taken from the Navy. And the job, so number one's job in the actual Navy would be executive officer. And it's important to understand the role of the executive officer when it comes to the executive officer's relationship to the captain. The XO's job is to question every single thing the captain does, and to question it without fear of reprisal, and to question it as though she has the same authority individually to the captain as he has to the crew. So you can't underestimate the fact that he put a woman in the XO's position here, because the XO's position is considered one of the most important on the ship after the captain, because it's their job to question the captain at every turn.
I really love how Strange New Worlds is elaborating on these relationships and these characters, because, again, TOS, they didn't really have the ability. The networks had expectations. The fan had expectations. They couldn't put a woman in other than Uhura's role, right? They really couldn't. But now they can.
Yeah.
And I really love how Strange New Worlds is fleshing out that relationship. I think all of the actors are phenomenal. I love the whole cast I'm really enjoying that series and really looking forward to seeing where it goes. I even love the musical, which was not everyone's favorite, right?
I loved it.
But it's just, they're having fun and they're making Star Trek in a good way. And they really do elaborate on that relationship between number one and the captain, and between Pike, right, and his particular number one.
Sure. And look what he does to go and make sure that he can get her back.
Yeah,
and so,
he's willing to defy any number of expectations and mandates to ensure that he keeps that advisor and that friend that he really does depend on. And we really see that relationship coming through in ways that even in a series, and I'll come back to Voyager, obviously, because it's my favorite, but between the captain and her number one, in this case, Janeway and Chakotay, right? We see a lot of that relationship in ways that we don't necessarily, we get Picard and Riker, right, in Next Gen, and they're obviously very good friends, and they rely on each other, et cetera, but we see it differently a little bit, I think, in Voyager. And also Strange New Worlds is doing neat things with that relationship to show how the captain can be vulnerable with another officer, and that officer can play and does play a very clear and central role in the operation of the ship and, their mission, et cetera.
I don't want to get too far away from Roddenberry himself here, who had the vision, and we wouldn't have any of this without him. He did introduce us to number one, in the original pilot. Then he also gives us, on the way out the door, Turnabout Intruder, which is about the most sexist piece of drivel I've ever seen on television. It's embarrassing. So how do you reconcile this guy?
You know, Roddenberry is, well, I mean, it's hard at this point, I think, to really for people to offer substantial critiques, because he's not with us any longer, unlike perhaps that other star, um, now Disney owned media, with its creator who a lot of people love to hate, for the way that universe has gone. But I think it's worth remembering that Roddenberry had a really great vision, and it was really important. He deliberately created the original series to critique the Vietnam War on television, right? And he was very deliberate in his intent to bring these critiques out in a science fiction manner. Does that mean we don't have women painted green wearing bikinis? No, right?
Or
Because
in the
oh my
naked now.
gosh, right?
Yeah.
And does it mean we don't have horrible TNG episodes for any number of reasons? No, of course not. And we've seen those continue too. I mean, there's a lot of really uh, cringe-worthy episodes in non-Roddenberry Trek as well, and maybe that's just part of Star Trek. I don't know. I think that that's just part of television, frankly, especially when television series were doing 22, 24, 26 seasons in a year and overworking everyone involved in production, and they're working 16-hour days. And I mean, and you've always got these filler episodes that just didn't need to be made, frankly, right?
No, you also have the whole sweeps. You're going to have to write more titillation episodes
Yes.
to attract more people during sweeps.
Well, at least
And
that's
there's
so
definitely
So the evaluation
yeah.
of the program's success is going to be tied, sex sells.
It does. And that's really television. I mean, especially maybe American television, but I think it's television more broadly. And, so it was interesting for me when I started this dissertation study, because I come from an English literature background. So, narrative studies, narrative analysis, but then I started branching into television. And so I had to start doing the television studies and to figure out how television is and does work differently than a novel, right? And the way that and so much of that is production, and so much of that is the network plays such a huge role. And it's not just what the creator wants. It's not just what an individual writer wants, right? And, I've read a lot of things about different episodes from the different writers and producers, and they'll say, we really wanted to go this direction, but we couldn't because, and it's either because an actor was sick, or because the network said no, or, the numbers dipped last week, so we have to do something a little bit sexier, and so there's so much going on, that it really, and this is one of the things I really love about television, is it really is such a conglomeration of influences. It's not just one author in one novel. It's not just Hemingway, right, writing the great American novel, and then, maybe it gets published, right? And there might have been an editor in there somewhere too. But other than that, it's very much a solo creation. And television, and one of the reasons I think television as a narrative is so important is because it does have so many different influencing factors. And what still manages to come through regardless then is, I think, even more relevant. And so I think, we've got to just acknowledge that, yes, there's some really terrible episodes. Because, and in large part, that's either because it's a filler, or because the network needs something or demands something, or, somebody's sick for a week and they got to figure something else out. Right. So
you see such a transition, I think, in the next generation where you have these early episodes where Troy is clearly there just to be objectified. And you had episodes like, I love The Naked Now, which was just a rerun of The Naked Time from the original series.
yeah.
They get the lose your inhibition virus, and you got various ways that the males react to it. All the women just get horny. All of them.
Well,
That's
clearly
it.
that's all they would do, right?
But then you see it maturing, and you see, Troy being treated as a full-on bridge officer and gets into a real uniform. So it seems like it came a long way. Is that
Yeah.
fair?
Yeah, I think that is fair. I mean, I think that Deanna's character is interesting, for a lot of reasons. And we see her progress from, the ridiculously short, tight skirt, low cut stuff to the more uniform oriented, but she's still never quite a Trek officer, in the same way that everyone else is. And I think it's interesting, not only because, in her relationship with Riker, kind of the on-off, will they, won't they sort of thing, which we see in Picard becomes married, but not without problems. And then, and her role on the ship as the counselor. It's also interesting, of course, Beverly Crusher is the doctor. Those are the positions where you would expect a woman to be a caretaker. And I really like both of their characters, and I do think we see a lot of development with them throughout the series, which is, relevant to the time period. I don't know if it's more that Roddenberry was not there any longer, but more that, times were changing in the 80s and 90s, and so was society, and television definitely reflects that. And then, we come in with both Voyager and Deep Space Nine, sort of on the tail end of course, Next Gen, and we see a woman in a command position in both of those shows, right? So, and not necessarily the overt caregiver position. It's interesting that in both of those series, the doctors are men, which is kind of showing us some neat things. I do think that Janeway sort of has a very motherly caregiver role, and that's one of the arguments that I ultimately make in my overall dissertation. And a portion of that chapter on Janeway has been published elsewhere. But Janeway really remains sort of a central caregiving figure, despite the fact that she's supposed to be this, yay, women can be in leadership positions and be caring and compassionate and yada yada, which is what the original, sort of producers were sort of originally intending.
I want to say something here that occurred to me while you were saying that, is that the captain of a ship is generally considered to be a caretaker, whether male or female. And I'm not necessarily sure that that's out of bounds for the role she would play as the captain of a starship, especially one that's stranded 70,000 light years away from any other help. You're absolutely right about the fact that she's kept more as a caretaker rather than the way you would see the male captain of a ship as a leader. But I think that element is there in the captain of any kind of ship, whether you're talking about the galaxy. I mean, the captain has the right to marry crew members. So
yeah, but it's interesting because, in a couple of interviews with, and I could certainly track these down. I think they're actually from Altman and Gross's Captain's Log, not the big recent one, but the earlier one, an unauthorized guide to some of the new Trek stuff published in the mid-90s, where, Jerry Taylor and other producers are sort of talking about how and what Janeway is going to do and how she's going to be different. And they zero in on that comparing and compassionate nature in contrast to Picard.
Yeah.
And they're very clear on sort of that. And I do think that, Picard is a phenomenal captain, but he's definitely not the most in touch perhaps with his emotions and with his crew, at least initially, right? He comes a long way, and I adore him, and Patrick Stewart is phenomenal, and all of those things. But one of the things that the producers were really sort of zeroing in on early on, at least in Janeway's conception, was that she was going to show us that women can be captains in the 24th century. Yay! Totally not a problem. There was never any hesitation on their part that it was just going to be the way it was. She was just going to be the captain, right? And that was that, don't call me ma'am, call me captain, right? As she tells poor Ensign Kim on his first very, very long first day of work there, in the pilot episode. I love that scene. But she, she's still going to be sort of this nurturing figure. And we see that kind of come through, particularly, I think, with her relationship with Seven of Nine. throughout the series as kind of almost a mother figure in some ways. I know some fans read that relationship differently, and all the other things that one can read into Star Trek. But yeah, it's I think Janeway on screen in the '90s was doing really phenomenal things. I think the reason we get a great character like Captain Burnham in Discovery, even in the 21st century, owes a lot to Janeway and Kate Mulgrew's phenomenal command of that bridge and that ship. And I think that Janeway is the most ruthless of all the Star Trek captains, frankly, that we've seen. And I think she is absolutely willing to do utterly anything to get her crew home, because that becomes her mission and her directive. Because saving that crew becomes sort of like her defining characteristic. So
Let's
yeah.
talk about the dichotomy in Voyager, though, and
Hmm.
just made me think of it when you brought up Jerry Taylor, who was, Berman really wanted there to help develop a woman captain. At least that's what they say.
Yes.
But then you have the introduction of Seven of Nine, and Seven of Nine is obviously there to titillate the way
Hmm.
she's
Dressed.
projected. But
That
behind the
outfit.
scenes, that outfit, right? And this in the promo pictures where
Hmm.
posing like she's a cat or something in
Yeah.
and behind the scenes though it was worse. Behind the scenes they were squeezing her into this outfit that had
Hmm.
sit that caused her problems, supposedly even made her pass out at one point. And then you got this real conflict between the two actresses
Hmm.
who were not getting along. And I don't know. I think that's almost an archetypal conflict they were having there. But how do you reconcile that? And for that matter, where was Jerry Taylor when all that was going on?
I think it's worth noting that Jerry Taylor left Voyager around that time. Maybe
Oh,
not
she did?
exactly. I'm pretty sure she did. I could be wrong. It's been a couple years,
Oh.
but she backed off at the very least. Right. And we can fact check me on this one. But I do think she bowed out, which is
Mhm.
interesting for starters. And yeah, the tension between and I always get mix myself up when talking about Jerry Taylor and Jerry Ryan in context, right? But Jerry Ryan, of course, who plays Seven of Nine, and Kate Mulgrew, who plays Captain Janeway, there was definitely tension there. They did not get along. I suspect a lot of that was the pressures of Hollywood puts on a woman, and the relationships that Rick Burnham had with both of them, which were not unproblematic. Right. And he's probably not the only one. I don't necessarily want to point fingers too much.
Now you can point
Although
fingers.
maybe
I
he
think that's
deserves a
fair.
pointed finger or three here at
Yeah,
this moment.
I
But
vote yes.
there was definitely a lot happening backstage that I'm sure was not just the fault of Kate and Jerry there, right? Or even just Kate. And I know she has spoken about this a little bit more recently. She's talked about it, I think, in one of her memoirs a little bit. But I think being a female actor, a female lead actor in Hollywood, even now would be very difficult, but I can only imagine it was worse in the 90s, especially when, you've got sex appeal being a very clear reason you're bringing in this new character, and dressing her like they did. I mean, that is just, there was nothing else going on there aside from the sex appeal, right? And I love Seven of Nine's character. I
Oh,
love
me too.
how she goes and how she develops. I'm thrilled that they brought her back in Picard. I think Jerry Ryan, is phenomenal. But so much of that situation was outside of the purview of any of the people involved, frankly, except maybe Rick Burnham,
Mhm.
and perhaps some other men, or individuals involved in the executive
Yeah.
producer camp.
And I want to make sure that because I sound like I'm victim blaming a little bit when I say
Hmm.
that they were at each other. It's true. It was the
Hmm.
environment.
Yeah.
And I'm going to point the finger at Rick Berman, but obviously it wasn't just him
Yeah.
that created that kind of tension, created that whole dynamic that
Hmm.
we see reflected all over the place.
Yeah, and I mean, when you think about the fact that they both Kate and Jerry had young children at that point, and it was just it was just probably just not a great scenario in and around the board. I haven't heard much or read much about any of the other women having significant problems on that set, but that doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't more going on, and I bet it was just tough, but it comes out as an interesting relationship on screen, for all that there might have been tension behind the screen. They have a phenomenal chemistry, however you choose to read it, on the screen, both Janeway and Seven of Nine. And it really, Seven of Nine does a lot to really bring perhaps male audiences to Voyager that kept it on the air, so maybe that's worth something. But I think she brought a lot to this story in really neat ways, that allowed for some really phenomenal episodes. Infinite Regress, for example, the episode where she's sort of suffering from some of her, not her previous, but some of the other Borg consciousnesses that are in her mind, and she's being a Ferengi and all kinds of other things. So it really gave them a lot of opportunities for some cool episodes and things like that. So I really love having her addition to Voyager, both the actor and the character.
Was Cass done dirty?
I don't know. Kes is an interesting one. I never liked her character because I think that she was just underutilized. I think they had some interesting. The Ocampa were weird. Let's be honest, right? Like, what were they even thinking with the Ocampa in the first place? I have a ton of criticisms of Caretaker, that involve the imperial attitude of Captain Janeway and the USS Voyager to just come in and shut down the Kazon and do whatever the hell they want. But yeah, Kess was weird. I don't know. I think Jennifer Lean did a good job. I think she was, there was a lot of potential for her character. I think she was poorly used by the writing staff, in kind of favor of giving more preference to, at that point, Janeway and Torres as the other two female characters. She was never really part of the crew. She was a nurse for a little while. She grew some neat plants. She had that weird thing with Neelix, but she was also only like 4, and then she sort of goes away. So I don't know. I think that there was some neat potential for Kes as a character, in ways that maybe never got used. But I think we can say the same for other characters, probably like Harry Kim, for example. And I also think Chakotay was terribly underused in the whole latter half of Voyager. So yeah.
Should we move to Enterprise?
Oh, Enterprise.
Mm.
That's a fun one.
Yeah.
I like Enterprise. I mean, it's sort of the one that fans kind of love to hate, right? With good reason. But and I don't know, the third season is terrible. The whole Zindi, it's the Zindi, right? Am I remembering them right? Yeah, the whole hunt for the Zindi and whatnot, the more reptilian aliens that we're gonna hate on. But which is a good Trek staple, of course. I don't know. I like the Hirogen. The Voyager underused them, unfortunately, in favor of the Borg, I think, as the evil bad guys. But anyway, Enterprise. To Paul.
Oh,
Yeah, I don't really know what to think about DePaul, to be honest. I think that she was a great character who had a lot of potential. I think it was really neat to see a female Vulcan for the first time. We hadn't really seen one of those, at least not in any long-term capacity. I don't think. And I don't know, the Vulcan are interesting in general, and I think that maybe it was much harder to conceptualize that for a female on the part of the writers. Maybe from the misconception that women tend to be more emotional than men. I don't know. Because there's that sort of emotion science divide that the Vulcans kind of have established by that point. But yeah, I don't know.
You do have the single example of T'Pau as an authoritative leader in the original series.
Yeah.
She's a very strong character in that episode, in the episode of Muck Time. She's authoritative. She is in charge of the process. no one questions her.
Does not take no for an answer.
Yeah. I refer to her as all of Vulcan wrapped up in one package. But then you also have, again, it's easy to go back to the original series just because so much is rooted there. When we first meet Spock's parents,
Oh,
and there's
yes.
clearly this sort of subservient role, and she's like, "Well, of course, he's a Vulcan. I'm just his wife." So you
I'm
get this
just here. Yes.
contradiction in the culture that
Hmm.
would have been really interesting to explore if their family dynamics are throwbacks, but their actual, leadership structure is more matriarchal. What the hell? That would have been an interesting.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting too because his mom's a human, right? And that becomes such a key point of Spock's ultimate characterization. Although, up until Discovery, we don't really get a whole lot of exploration into what that might actually mean to have a human mother when they're doing a lot more with his backstory with season 2 of
Yeah.
Discovery, right? And also, I guess we're getting some of that in Strange New Worlds. I should correct myself, because we're getting the continuation of that early Spock right before Kirk and that version of the Enterprise, in the timey-wimey world of Star
Right.
Trek timelines, which I kind of hate and kind of love at the same time. But yeah, so it's interesting because, Amanda is human, and so therefore this sort of subservient character, because she's human, so she's less than, and all Vulcans sort of have that anti-human, those humans doing these wild and crazy things like thinking with their emotions and pushing buttons when they shouldn't and everything, right? Which we get so frequently in so many different iterations. Every Vulcan is just always looking their nose down at humans, right? And yet they're letting them lead the Federation. So there's an interesting something happening there too. But yeah, and then I think we're getting some interesting Vulcan female characters as well. Also, I'm going to come back to Discovery because we have the counselor. I'm blanking on her title and name, frankly. But it's not Vulcan anymore, it's Navarre, right? But it's
Right.
essentially the same thing. So we have yet another female leader who seems much less authoritarian than our initial introduction to Vulcan female leadership,
Yeah.
from TOS, but also still she's very poised, she's very in control, and yet she's got this interesting, as far as season 4 is concerned, sort of developing relationship with Saru there as well. I haven't
Right.
seen season 5 yet, but I know
Oh
there's
God, right.
things that will
I
go on in
almost
season
blurted a
five.
spoiler on season 5. Oh God, I'm glad you
I'm not
reminded.
terribly adverse to spoilers, but I have kind of largely avoided them. But I know there's something, right? So yeah, so the Vulcan female is an interesting figure, and T'Pol was really the first large exploration of that. And of course, we have another beautiful actress wearing a relatively tight suit, not perhaps quite as restrictive as Jerry Ryan's was as Seven of Nine. In Voyager, maybe we've come a little bit far there by 2001 and the onset of Enterprise. But I think that the writers didn't really know how to play a female Vulcan or how to write a female Vulcan. Sorry. So she's very cut off from the crew. She doesn't really interact. She doesn't really form too many relationships, except with Trip, maybe here and there, just a little bit of hint of something, maybe, right? And yeah, I'm not sure. Which I think is something we can say about Enterprise as a whole. Maybe we're just not sure what's happening there in a lot of respects.
Well, I'm curious, Mark. I want to go back to the series that not enough people are watching, or have watched, and it's in Doom. But I'm curious, have you watched any of Prodigy?
I have not.
You
Unfortunately,
haven't?
I'm not up to date on Prodigy. But what's happened is now you have this balkanization of streaming services. So that I'm not going to
Well,
I'm
and
not
this
going to
one's
buy them
bouncing.
all.
Yeah.
I mean, this one's the bouncing ball. You have to follow it from streaming service to streaming service.
That's true. You're right.
Yeah, I hope it survives, but
Me too.
you I'm a little dubious of its chances, though.
Yeah, me
But
too. I think we'll get a season 2, and then I don't think we'll see more, frankly. But
I think you're right. What do you like about Prodigy?
well, I think I love quite a few things about Prodigy. And first and foremost, when I first saw the trailer for it, not only was I interested in an animated sort of geared toward, I'm not going to say kids because it's not a kids show. It's not exclusively a kids show.
I was gonna say,
It's geared towards families, and I think there's a huge nostalgia factor for Voyager fans, which A is me, right? They couldn't have pinned me better if they had tried, especially since the premise is that the show starts with kids who aren't members of the Federation. And that is what I have been wanting Trek to do since I first started really thinking about Star Trek seriously. I have wanted a show that follows non-Federation characters, that tells us a different story. And we get that for about 3/4 of the first 2 episodes. And then bam, we're on a Federation ship, and hologram Voyager shows up and asks if anybody needs help. And I
yeah.
love hologram Voyager. I love Admiral Voyager, who shows up at the end of the first season. I love it all. And she's great. But I really wanted this to be more of a what do we do if we're not part of the Federation sort of
Mm.
show. But I think it's really fun. The animation is phenomenal. It's absolutely visually insane. Like, even if you just watch the opening credits, which I'm sure you can probably find on a non-paid for streaming service, right? Just to sort of watch a clip of the 60-second opening credits, like, those graphics are impressive. And I like the story, I like the characters. It's Star Trek, so there's wonky episodes for sure, even in the first season. Or, well, frankly, there's always wonky episodes in the first season of any Star Trek, so I think that we can expect
That is
that.
true. That is
Yeah.
true.
Yeah. The first season is always a bit of a doozy sometimes, I think, while they find their feet. But yeah, I think it tells an interesting story. It's I want to know where it goes. I'm curious to see what happens now. Of course, spoilers. Is it okay? Spoilers. Is that okay?
I think that's okay.
Are we okay with that?
Unless, oh, Mark, are you going to be watching it?
I
I
can
will,
stop.
but spoilers never bother
Okay,
me.
spoilers
Okay.
never bother you. Okay, so spoilers for anyone listening, if you don't want to. We end up finding the Federation, right? Our ragtag crew of teenagers who've escaped imprisonment on a mining asteroid, right? And we end up finding the Federation and finding our place in this larger organization, right? And then presumably in season 2, we get to go on some sort of mission with the real Janeway, to find a certain someone who's been missing for a while, who Janeway really likes, and wants to save. Who fans of Voyager might recognize. But at any rate, so we're, so we're there now. So I think that it's I'm afraid that it's sort of lost some of that thing that's going to have drawn me into it initially, which was what else is happening in this Star Trek universe when you're not part of the Federation. But nonetheless, I look forward to seeing where it goes. And I do hope that Netflix will, keep going with it, but I'm dubious.
Hey, Mark, so the coolest thing about Prodigy, as an old man that I am, and I know you're an old man too, is that one of the characters, my favorite character, is a Medusan.
There you
He's
go.
great.
A
Yeah.
Medusan walking around in this, containment suit.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
everyone's
He's
not
fun.
going insane.
And Murph, don't forget about Murph, the adorable little indestructible blob of blue energy that slips around on the ship and streaks across the windshield of
Well,
the protostar every now and then and stuff.
I want to
So
bring Picard into this because of what you said.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not a big fan of Picard as a series. I've only seen the first season, but
okay.
I think there's too much fan service in it.
Yeah.
But having said that, you talked about how you wanted to see a series based on non-Federation characters. What's Seven of Nine doing?
Yeah, I would love to explore her backstory more.
Well,
And
what I like about it is that as a former member of the Borg, she would be utterly shunned by Starfleet.
mhm.
And yet she wants to do something that I see, arguably, I don't think she would have joined this this organization, I forget the name of it, something Rangers,
Oh yeah, I
without her
forget
exposure to
exactly.
Starfleet, because she sees
Yeah.
the good things that Starfleet's doing and would like to be part of it. But the cultural paradigm of the Federation, because the Borg were intent on assimilating them, would not accept her. And so I think she's good because in this particular role, she tests the Federation's commitment to diversity,
Yeah.
which is interesting because they've already done a little bit of that, and starting with the next generation and assimilating the Klingons.
Which
And
definitely would have caused
what's the
problems.
difference? There's not a whole lot of difference. The Klingon Empire for centuries tried to destroy the Federation.
Yeah, there definitely would have been some tense meetings in those early days, I suspect. Yeah. And of course, Worf is really the only Klingon in Starfleet by the time Next Gen really picks up and kicks off at
Mm.
whatever star date we've got there. And that really hasn't changed by Voyager, because B'Elanna, the figure who's half Klingon, half human, is also one of the only ones even by that point. And, that hasn't changed much, presumably, in later years. But yeah, bringing Seven of Nine back onto Picard was a really fascinating decision for me to see. I have watched the full run of Picard, and I did enjoy parts of it for different reasons. I think they did some neat things. I do agree with you, Mark, that it's a lot of fan service, and the third season in particular, when they bring everybody back, it's not bad, right? It is good Star Trek, but it is also just like, can we do something new now, please? Maybe a little bit. Let's even bring back the original ship. But at any rate,
Yeah.
to save the Federation from imminent destruction again, um, as they often have to do. But yeah, bringing Seven of Nine in was an interesting, neat choice. I liked seeing where her character had gone, right? Because when Voyager, of course, ends, which left most of us terribly upset, is they just get home and then it's over, right? So now what? And of course, there's a lot of media, there are a lot of novels that play with what might have happened, and in many of them, of course, Seven of Nine does join Starfleet. But that always, of course, those are not canon in air quotes, and not necessarily what the show narratives connect with. But that always seemed like a path that Seven of Nine would not be able to take. I never would have envisioned her. She might have tried, right? Because let's be honest, Janeway got her hooked good on being a good human individual who does things for the Federation, right? And for her crew. And I think that Janeway was very successful in her conversion of Seven of Nine. But I do think that would not have worked for Seven, right? So it was interesting to see in Picard that she had gone another way and maybe joined a different organization. And I would love to see a story that follows what happened between those 2 points, or even
Yeah.
after that point, for the Seven of Nine
Yeah,
character. I'd
definitely.
love to see a Seven of Nine. Let's go join the Rangers or whatever they are and do the good works that the Federation claims they're going to do, but doesn't actually get around to. And maybe we offload some medical supplies and run them to the Romulans or something, right? And doing, just sort of doing other off the grid kind of things.
Yeah,
Because I think that would have been where she would have
the
flourished.
parallel is they would behave like Firefly,
Yes.
doing what they have to do for the people that they need to take care of, but also being willing to break whatever Starfleet or
Hmm.
Romulan or whatever restrictions might have on them. So
Yeah, exactly. And I actually, I love that you mentioned Firefly, because I think I get a big Firefly vibe in
yep,
Seven of Nine's
yep.
attire and appearance and attitude. She's absolutely a brown coat,
We got to find some way to get.
in
Right.
We got to find some
in
way to
that.
reincorporate
Yeah,
Firefly back into
yeah,
popular culture, for
yeah.
God's sake.
So good.
So we should probably think about wrapping up, but can we all agree? And we got to talk about it because I mean we've mentioned Michael Burnham.
Mm.
We haven't really gotten into her. We probably should here, but can we all agree she's a great character? And I'm going to put in my own appreciation for Tilly.
Yes.
Also,
I love Tilly.
Tilly breaks so many stereotypes, not just of, women in these shows, but just of anybody in these shows. I mean, this is not your typical, Starfleet officer, and the character, but the character's not goofy. I mean, she makes a lot of jokes, you laugh at her, but she's a fully realized character.
Oh yeah, and she's a serious officer too.
Yeah, she's a totally serious officer. So I just think that's speaks to how deeply, and I know not everybody likes Discovery. Sometimes it gets too touchy-feely for me, I'll admit it, um but what they've done in really rounding out these characters, especially the women characters,
hmm
has just been so commendable, so extraordinary.
Yeah, I think Discovery is doing some phenomenal things on a lot of fronts, especially where its diversity is concerned.
Yeah.
I also think that it's recreating a lot of imperial narratives that I find problematic,
Oh, interesting.
which is
We'll have to have
one
you
of the
back
things that,
on.
yeah. I'm working on finalizing a book chapter that digs into this in more detail with both Discovery and Picard, which I can finish once I watch the fifth season. So that needs to happen very soon. But so we can talk about that too. But yeah, I think that the diversity that they're bringing in, the way they're fleshing out characters, I really like the relationships between the characters. I think they're doing really neat things. I love Tilly. I regret that they kind of foisted her off a little bit toward the end.
Yeah.
For whatever reason that happened, I do miss her on the show and in a more central place. But I mean, they're doing a lot of different stories, different kinds of stories, and different kind of storytelling in Discovery, which is one reason I think a lot of fans are less, or some fans are less into it, because it is a different kind of Star Trek. And but I also think that that's okay, to each their own, right? I'm not a huge Lower Decks fan, for example, because that's just not really the kind of thing that I enjoy. But I know it's doing a lot of really great things and a lot of people really love it. And hey, that's awesome that we have so many different examples of kinds of things that we can gravitate to. So yeah, I mean, Michael Burnham is a phenomenal character. The actress is doing an amazing job. I love how she's got a command position, but she struggles to get there. She's got a lot of guilt in the early seasons, which can be hard, from a storytelling perspective, to kind of dig into and stick with. But then, I like that she's developing these relationships with characters. And how she really does seem more of like a real person than I think of a lot of our captains have been in the past. Even Janeway, because they're still relatively, I'm not going to say one-dimensional, maybe two-dimensional as captains and as people, just because that's how the stories were being written at the time. But I think we're getting something a little bit different now, which is really neat. And I don't know that it's not just limited to the female characters. Of course, we've got the existence of the first non-binary character on Star Trek in Adira, which is amazing. And we've also, of course, got a married gay couple, which is also, I think, really important from a diversity standpoint. And that's just sort of part of who they are, and that's just normal, and they just move on, right? And it isn't sort of a linchpin of the narrative, but it also serves, the story in other key ways. So yeah, Discovery is doing some really neat things. I'm thrilled that it exists. I look forward to seeing the fifth season and
It's
seeing
good.
what they do with it. And are there areas I think they could have done different things? Yes, maybe we can rebuild the Federation differently for a change instead of just doing it all over again. But they did give Stacey Abrams the role of President of Earth, so I can't fault them for that one.
Yeah, that was cool.
That was
Well,
great.
Lee, thank you so much for oh, Mark, you
Mark
had something to
wants to
We
say?
say
forgot
something.
somebody.
Who did we
Who'd
forget?
we forget?
We forgot Keiko in Deep Space Nine.
Oh, Keiko.
Well, the reason why I bring her up is because
Yes.
she reflects something that I think it's important to understand about Star Trek when you're looking at representation, whether it's women, whether it's queer characters, whether it's alien characters for that matter, is that it's important to understand the distinction between Star Trek as a production and Star Trek's vision of the future as fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a big interaction between the two. One of the things that they lauded Next Generation for was its depiction of people who were not Starfleet officers or Starfleet enlisted in their life on a starship. And I think that's really important, the way Keiko, although clumsily and although not well written, represents the idea that these Starfleet officers had families and they played not exactly a traditional family role in every instance in every episode. And so, I mean, I do think that it's important to kind of at least make a
Yeah.
nod toward Keiko and what they were trying to do with that.
Yeah, yeah. I think Keiko is one of the many instances, and this is something that I kind of keep coming back to in my larger critiques of the sort of imperial narratives underwriting a lot of Star Trek, is that even with all of these other things, there are possibilities and moments where they've hinted that something different can happen. And those are the moments that I like to zero in on. And Keiko is one of those, right? Sure, she's just the mom and the school teacher, right? But she's there and she gives us a slightly different take on what it might mean to be involved with the Federation as someone who is a member, but not a member of Starfleet,
Well,
right?
especially in the episode where poor O'Brien ends up going through mental prison. You mean she has an important role in trying to help him deal with the PTSD behind all that.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's something,
Definitely.
that familial connection within Starfleet, that's not something you get from the organization, that has to come from somewhere else. I think that's kind of we at least have to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and I do like that Deep Space Nine really did bring that in at least occasionally, right? Because we have, Picard's mention in one of the first moments of TNG, like, oh my gosh, we have to have families here. Why would we do that? Children? Get them away from me, right? And then, of course, we have something like Voyager where there is none of that because it's just more of a research vessel, except, of course, for Naomi Wildman, who's kind of there on accident. Because her mom just happened to be pregnant when we get sucked to the other end of the galaxy. Oops. And then of course in Enterprise we don't see any of that because again, small ship, right? And it's not even in Discovery. So Deep Space Nine gives us the potential to play around with those relationships, not just the Quark's bar and pass her through to the station, but also the fact that there are families here and that there's tension and that there's purpose and those relationships are really interesting. I do wish they had done a lot more with her role and that relationship because I think her relationship with O'Brien had a lot of potential to explore more. And this episode you mentioned, Mark, is a really great example of the role that a loving spouse or partner can play regardless of gender, right? In a relationship.
Exactly.
And we see that in Discovery, the relationship between Stamets and Culber, actually, I think, which is really neat. The way that they help each other and the way that their committed relationship benefits both of them. And that's a sort of a healthy relationship to see on the screen, regardless of the gender of participants. Right. And it would have been neat to see Deep Space Nine do more of that.
I have to give a shout out to the Orville.
Yes.
Because they did that exact thing before Star Trek did it.
Yeah.
I think it's hilarious that we sort of breezed by Deep Space Nine for a while.
Yeah.
There was a lot of really interesting female characters. And which one do we mention and focus on?
the least utilized one, perhaps. Although we gotta say, best female villain in Star Trek
It's true.
is Deep Space Nine.
Oh,
I mean, she's amazing.
And one of the best actors in all of Star Trek.
Oh my gosh. She's
the
phenomenal.
pedigree
Louise
she
Fletcher,
brings to that role. And
good.
Star Trek is known for
so
people
much.
Star Trek is known for people who chew the scenery. But wow, she definitely brings that Nurse Ratched energy to this role in a big way.
She was great. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
You bring up too a woman villain too, because that's also something we haven't really dove into. But so we've got a long one here, folks. I think we better wrap it up.
Okay.
But, sorry, that was my fault this time.
No, it's been great. I mean, literally, I could go on for another hour. I'm not even kidding. This is great stuff. And we'll have to have you back to talk about imperialism.
I would love
Star
that.
Trek.
I also have a lot to say about that one.
Yeah, we should wait
So-
until after Section 31, the movie comes out.
I agree with that for sure. Because
Yes.
one of my focuses as a PhD student was I wrote my dissertation on intelligence analysis and intelligence failure.
Okay.
And so I have a lot to say about this particular aspect of Star Trek with
Yes.
Section 31.
I would love to be a part of that conversation when we get that exciting new Star Trek. How exciting. I love the fact that there's still so much of it and still so much to say, and I do really hope that continues, and that the streaming service end of things doesn't come back and bite us when Paramount suddenly can't juggle all these balls anymore.
Right. Okay. Well, Dr. Leigh McKagen,
Yes.
thank
Well,
you so
thank
much
you.
for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I've had a great time.
Our theme music is by Christopher Piatek.